Hey everyone, welcome back to Shop Life. We're finally doing some work on our daily, the wagon with the 330 swap. So this right here is a 2001 325i. Like I said, we've done a 330 swap from a 330i. So the engine is an M54 B30. Same thing, this whole process will apply to the 2.5, so the 325. Any M54, even the M52 is very same. It's very same. It's very similar. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be using the Vanos Seals kit. I actually got this kit off of ECS Tuning. I'll have everything linked down below. But yeah, we're going to be doing the Rattle kit and the seals. So the Rattle mostly applies to the 330s. The 325s and the 2.5 liters, they usually don't have as much of that Vanos rattle. I mean, it is still possible, but it's much more prominent on the 3.0. So we're going to be installing that Rattle kit on here as well. For that, you do need an extra tool that I know Bason Systems has. It's like a rubber holder that goes into your vise. That way you don't mess up the piston when you're trying to unscrew it. You'll see what I'm talking about here in a little bit. We've already got the valve cover and everything off of this engine. I have a video that goes over the valve cover replacement, so we'll have that link down below so that way you can get to this step. You do have to remove the fan and stuff, which the valve cover gasket video will not show. But if you look at any of my cooling system videos, I show you how to remove the fan as well. If you have a manual car or you've done the electric fan conversion, it's very easy to pull it out. But if you have the normal clutch fan, you will need the clutch and clutch holding tool to hold the water pump pulley while you pull the fan off. But all that stuff will be linked down below. And this will also be a good time to replace your Vanos oil feed line. This line goes to the back of the oil filter housing. If you don't want to replace the line, you're at least going to need these two washers, so make sure you have those. This is also a good time to clean out your Vanos solenoids, which I'll be showing that as well. But yeah, let's just go ahead and get to it. I've got everything taken off, as you can see. I'm covering up the lower radiator hose because you are going to leak some oil from down here, especially when we start pulling out the whole Vanos assembly. Yeah, so make sure you have a bunch of rags that don't leave lint behind, and you're also going to need a few more towels and stuff to clean everything as you're going through it. So this one is nowhere near as complicated as the S54 Vanos, which I have recently published a whole series on the channel, because this you're not really messing with the timing. So you don't have to worry about having any specialty tools or anything like that. And this process is very easy compared to the S54. All right, so to begin, we're just gonna undo all these connectors for the Vanos solenoid, the camshaft position sensor as well, and also the thermostat, and just move all the wiring to one side. So for this, you just have two clips, one on each side. Just squeeze them. So you squeeze these two clips right here and pull it off. And then for the Vanos solenoid on the exhaust side, you just have this metal clip, push it down, and then you can pull off the connector. Try not to tug on the wires because these are probably going to be brittle at this point in the E46 life. So just try to pull on the connector and not the actual wires. And just be very careful because a lot of this protectant on the wiring is probably going to start falling off. So just try not to get anything inside the engine bay. Well, not the engine bay, but inside the engine. And I'm sorry if you guys can hear all the background noise. My neighbor has his machines running right now, which is why it's so loud. Bam. Then we've got the thermostat connector. And now we can just move this whole harness to the side. And usually all of this is going to be dried up and cracking. This would actually be a good time to replace that. You can find all this protectant stuff on eBay. I don't think the BMW stuff is heat protective, so I would suggest buying the one that is heat protective. That way, it doesn't crumble in the future again. But chances are, even the heat protective stuff eventually is going to crumble. Now we've got the solenoid for the intake side, this connector right here. Same thing as the exhaust, just push this metal clip in, and then you can pull off the connector. There we go. So now we can remove this Vanos oil line as well. You're going to need a 19mm open-ended wrench. And just make sure you have a rag because oil will spill out from right here. And this is a banjo bolt. So you'll see the washers. Make sure you retrieve all the washers and everything. You don't want that just hanging around your belts. Here's the bolt. Now I've actually got my air box and everything removed as well, just because I knew I was going to replace this Vanos oil line, but you don't really have to remove that unless you are going to be replacing this line. And main reason is because the line goes all the way to the back of the oil filter housing, and that's why I have all this removed, so I have access to it. But for right now, we're just going to continue on without messing with this. Let me just put it to the side. Now we're going to remove this bracket. This is the bracket that you would use to lift up the engine. So in order to remove that, you do have to remove a 13mm bolt that goes to the top of the thermostat. You're not going to lose any coolant, but I mean, I will still just check after we've done the whole process, just make sure that there's no seepage or any drops. Just if your thermostat was really old and the gasket was really dried out, there is a very slim chance that you might move it around or do something in order for it to start leaking. So yeah, we've got this 13mm bolt right here, and then we have an 11mm nut up here. It does help to have a cleaner engine bay before you start doing this. That way, you have less of a chance of dropping dirt or having any dirt getting into your engine. And if it's not all oily and grimy, it's easier to remove all this stuff as well. All right, so now you really want to cover up your lower radiator hose and your AC belt, because now you're actually going to have some real oil seepage or leakage, however you want to say it. All right, so we're going to be removing both of these caps. They're 8mm hex. You can break the C's first if they're really tight, and then just thread it out with your hand. Oh, dang. Hold on. I'm going to use a little cheater bar on this. And I would just keep everything coordinated with exhaust and intake side. So just put two separate sections. That way you don't, really misplace anything. Most of the stuff is exactly the same, but it's just, good to have it go back where it came from. So this side will be the intake. This side will be the exhaust. Oh, whoa. Whoa, 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 whoa. That was a lot more oil than I was expecting. Next, there are two caps that we have to remove to get access to the Torx bolts behind them. So you're just going to use needle nose pliers. You can twist and just pull on them a little bit until it releases. There we go. There's an O-ring on it, and there's also these 4 tabs. Now we're going to be removing 2 Torx 30 bolts, one from the intake, one from the exhaust side, and these are left-hand thread, so you have to turn them clockwise to loosen them. So make sure you're really on there properly, because these will break pretty easy, but if they do break, you don't have to worry. You're going to have enough space to remove the rest of the threads once we have the whole Vanos assembly off. But let's just try not to break them. There's one. Let's get the exhaust side. They're both the same size bolts. Next, we're going to remove the rest of the Vanos mounting nuts. That way we can actually pull the whole Vanos assembly off. These are all mostly 10mm bolts, or 10mm nuts, sorry. And we're going to do the bottom ones first. So here's one right here. We're just going to loosen all of them first. There's one more nut right next to this camshaft position sensor. And you've got this corner one right here. And the one that goes right here is going to be a 13, which is more of a stud than a nut. But let's go and remove all the other ones first. And we have this 13 on the top corner. All right, so now we're going to try to cover up the Vanos because oil is going to spill out when we're trying to pull it off. So let's just try to get as much of it into the bag as we can. That way it's not just covering the radiator hose and the belt. We can just pull the Vanos off. You're just going to pull it straight towards the front of the car. So what you want to do with the Vanos unit, just have like a drain pan or something that you can dump as much of the oil that's in here out. You know, just keep moving it around, turning in different angles until the oil stops dripping out pretty much. There's going to be quite a bit of oil in here, so just try to do that. That way we don't make a mess later on. Now we've got most of the oil drained out, so we have, you know, the whole Vanos assembly right here. This right here is the intake side. This is the exhaust side. So we're going to be removing these covers, and like I said before, you want to try to keep everything that came off the intake side on this, you know, together, and same thing with the exhaust. That way you don't mix them up. All right, so let's just remove these covers. They're held in with 10mm bolts. You can obviously see the difference between the intake and the exhaust side. This one has 5, this one has only 4 bolts. So let's go ahead and remove them. They're all 10mm bolts. With all the bolts out, you can pull up on the cap to remove it. Now you have the Vanos piston. Go ahead and pull that out. Now we're going to do the same thing on the exhaust side. Only thing with this side, there is a spring behind here, so it might force it off. So in order to remove all the bolts without any problems, you might have to just push it down a little bit, the whole cap. You can see it starting to come up already. And the piston actually came out with it. You want to make sure that you don't bend any of these gaskets, but we are going to be cleaning all of this stuff in a little bit. Just make sure you remember the orientation of the spring. So it goes, the wider part goes on the bottom and actually sits right in that little crevice. You can clean all of this stuff up with brake cleaner and just use a clean microfiber or something like that. That way it doesn't leave any lint behind, and make sure you don't mar up any of the walls. You should be able to notice right away as far as if your seals were really that bad. You should be able to tell just by looking at, you know, how it fits in here. You see how loose it is? Like, it shouldn't be that loose. Same thing with the intake. You see how loose it is? Bam. All right, let's just go ahead and clean up all the oil off of the pistons, because that's what we're going to mess with first to get all the seals and everything replaced. Now we've got these soft vise jaw liners that I've already put on my vise, and we have the piston. This is the exhaust side. Like I said, both the exhaust and intake pistons are the same, but we're just, you know, trying to keep it oriented with whatever it came out of. But yeah, so here's the exhaust side. I haven't replaced any of the seals yet because we are doing the rattle repair. If you're not going to do the rattle repair, then you can just skip this whole process and keep continuing on with the seals, which we'll do right after this. So in order to do this, you are going to need like an electric impact wrench with a 24mm socket to loosen this section right here. And we're just going to put this in the vise and tighten it down first. You're going to do short little bursts in reverse. This is just normal thread. And once again, this is a 24mm socket. One burst and it came off. There's the cap. It actually came off with one of the washers. Now we have this radial bearing. Then we have this middle washer, another bearing, Alright, so first we're going to insert the bottom washer. I went ahead and cleaned all of the parts, so you should do the same. And the bottom and the top washers, they're practically the same thing. Doesn't matter which side you put it, but try to just put it the same way that it came out. And now we're going to use one of the new Rattle rings. Make sure it goes all the way in. Once the ring is seated all the way, now we can put this roller bearing. Next we have this middle washer. Then we have this top thrust bearing, or roller bearing, whatever it is. Then we have this washer. And finally we have the cap. Once again, this is just a normal thread, so righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. Alright, now we're going to do the same exact thing on the intake piston. Loosen it with the impact, take out all the washers, bearings. We're going to replace this with the new one that came with the Rattle kit, and then clean all the parts and put everything back together the same way it came out. Alright, so now that we've got the Rattle kits installed on both pistons, let's go ahead and replace the seals. In order to do that, we're going to have to cut out the seals first. So you're going to cut like a cross section that we can remove the Teflon seal first, and there's an O-ring on the inside that you have to remove, and you're going to do that on both. Once you've cut this cross section, you can use like a pick and get the seal out. Now you're going to cut the O-ring and do the same thing. Now let's do the small one. Now you want to clean inside of the grooves really well. And once again, you can use brake cleaner. So now we're going to start out with putting the O-ring in first. And the Teflon seal. This one you are going to have to stretch out a little bit. Make sure it's seated properly. You don't want it to be bent or curved at all. It might seem like it's a little loose, but once we insert it into the cylinder, it should, tighten up and get to the right size. If you're having a lot of trouble like getting it to slide on, you can put it in keep it in like a bag and put the bag in like hot water. That way, it'll just let it loosen up a little bit and it'll make it easier to stretch out. You want to make sure that the O-ring is sitting right in the center. You're going to do the same thing on this one, stretch it over. Now let's do the same thing to the other piston. Alright, now we're going to coat this Teflon seal with some oil. And then we're going to put it into the actual cylinder. That way we can let it resize. Also go ahead and coat the cylinder as well. And now when you're putting it in, put it in at an angle. That way it'll just regroup that whole seal and push it in a little bit more. And then just try to straighten it out. Now I'm just going to leave it in there for about a minute. That way it'll, resize, and then we'll pull it back out. In the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and put some oil on this smaller seal and put some oil on this actual cap itself. Since we're doing the exhaust side, you want to use the exhaust cap. And now once that one's resized, then we'll go ahead and put it into the cap. All right, so it's been about a minute. Let's go ahead and pull it out. And it has been resized. Now let's insert it into the cap. Now we'll let it sit in the cap for about a minute, and then we should be good. Now they've got all of the seals resized. Just make sure there's no dirt or dust anywhere in these walls or on the pistons. Just try to clean it up as much as you can. And then what we're going to do is we're going to lubricate all of these walls. So just get some oil, get it all in there, even inside. Now we're going to line up the spring. And then we're going to put this piston in. For the exhaust side, you're going to probably have to put the cap on as well in order to make it a little bit easier. Now we're just going to put the bolts in. Just go ahead and hand tight them. The exhaust side only has 4 bolts on this cap. Now let's do the intake side. Push it all the way in. Let's get the cap, line it up. All right, now that we've got everything assembled, go ahead and clean all of the surfaces as much as you can. And now you just want to make sure that these pistons are moving just properly. So just push this one down. This one is the exhaust side, which has the spring, so it's going to be a little bit harder. But you should be able to push it, and it'll just return. Now on this one, you're just going to have to go from the back, in and out. We're good. All right. With that said, now let's clean everything else. We're going to be replacing this Vanos gasket, so go ahead and pull that off. Now clean the mating surface right here as well. Now here's the new seal that came from ECS Tuning. Sometimes they do this with their seals. They just fold them and put them in the, however they're shipping them, which I really don't like. But since this is a metal seal, it shouldn't be that big of a deal. If you really wanted to, you could put a little bit of RTV around here. You don't really have to, but if you want, you can. Now we're just going to go ahead and slide this over all the studs. Sometimes these dowels do come out onto the Vanos assembly itself. If it does, it's not that big of a deal. Just make sure that you put the gasket on the dowels on the Vanos instead. That way it lines up properly, and just make sure everything goes accordingly. Also go ahead and clean up all these fasteners that you're going to go back on here. That way we can go ahead and put the whole Vanos assembly back together. All right, let's take the Vanos. With the gasket already in place, we should be able to slide the Vanos right on. Now let's just start putting all of the mounting nuts and this stud back in place. You can go ahead and start tightening them down. Just try to tighten all of them evenly. So we have this one 13mm stud, then you have the rest are 10mm nuts all around. Make sure they're all nice and tight. Once those are all tight, now we can put the bolts that go through the pistons back in. So if you order the kit from ECS Tuning, they also include new caps and new bolts. If you don't order the ECS Tuning kit, you get the Bison Systems or anywhere else. All you have to do is remove this O-ring off of these caps, and they also supply new O-rings to put on them made out of Viton. So these are the factory caps, and these O-rings are not Viton, but ECS Tuning does give you Viton O-rings to replace these as well. So we're going to do that, but first we have to put these bolts in. I would highly suggest making sure you have new bolts to go, regardless what kit you get, just because the chances of these breaking is pretty high. I mean, sometimes they don't, but I would still replace them anyways. All right, so first we're going to put these bolts back in. Once again, these are left-hand thread. So in order to tighten them, you have to turn them counterclockwise. And they're T30. I'm going to hand tight both of them first, and then we'll tighten them down. All right. So two T30 bolts, you want to tighten them down to 6 foot-pounds. And once again, they're left-handed thread, so make sure you're going counterclockwise to tighten. One thing that you can do is make sure this intake piston is pushed all the way in towards the camshaft. It should be already, but just in case, just push it in, and that way it'll be a little bit easier for you to tighten the bolt and make sure everything is nice and good. Besides that, make sure all these bolts are nice and tight, and once you have these torqued down, then we're going to put these caps on. So for the caps, just grab it with your needle nose. And then just push it in. You can rotate it, make sure it doesn't fall out. Make sure the threads are clean for the bolt caps, and make sure you clean up the bolt itself or the cap. And these are just normal threads, so just go ahead and tighten these down. Once again, these are 8mm hex. Now with those nice and tight, only thing that's left is to put the banjo bolt for this Vanos supply line with the new washers in. But for me, since I am going to be replacing this line, we're just going to skip that step. But what we will do is go ahead and reroute the actual thermostat and the camshaft position sensor and solenoid wiring. So let's go ahead and pull out the microfiber. If you got any oil on any of your hoses, make sure you get all that cleaned up. But before we route this, let's put this engine lift handle back on. You want to get it on this threaded shaft first, and then route it around. So let's go ahead and put this nut on. This is an 11mm nut. And you have the 13mm bolt that goes through the thermostat. You can plug in the solenoid first. And just push it right in, and then the camshaft position sensor. Make sure the connector and the actual sensor itself is nice and clean before you push it on. And then we have the thermostat connector. And then we have one more solenoid for the intake. There we go. Now the last thing is just this Vanos oil supply line. And that's just pretty simple. You just get the banjo bolt, new washer on this side, another washer on this side, It's a 19mm banjo bolt. Line it up, thread it in, and tighten it down. Besides that, the rest of the procedure, all you're going to do is just follow the whole valve cover replacement guide. What I would recommend is make sure just have everything hooked up, get the valve cover, all that stuff back on. If you're changing your spark plugs, make sure you do that as well. But do not plug in the ignition coils and just turn the car on and try to crank it. And what that's going to do is that's going to build up some oil pressure and get some oil going through the Vanos. That way you don't have like too much of a dry start. I mean, even if you did, theoretically, you'll be fine. But I like to just do that just so that way there's some oil in there and it starts pressurizing it. Also, you're going to want to reset all of the adaptations just because all those seals and everything is going to be new. And you might notice some check engine lights, some rough idling for the first couple minutes until the Vanos has no more air in it and it's just all oil. So if that does occur, just make sure you erase all the lights and just keep driving it, turning it on, and see how it feels. If the lights come, at least for the next couple of weeks, just keep erasing them. And you do want to let these Vanos seals break in, so try not to step on it too much. I would try to keep it under 3,000 to 4,000 RPM for at least about 200 to 300 miles. But besides that, that's going to conclude this DIY. Hope this helped you out. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment down below, and I'll see you guys in my next video.